For most of the war, the border between Belarus and Ukraine has been viewed as one of Europe's most dangerous frontiers. It was from this direction that Russian forces launched their failed assault on Kiev in 2022. Since then, every military exercise, every troop movement, every political statement, and every political statement from Minsk has raised the same question. Will Belarus become an active battlefield again? Over the past few weeks, that question has taken an unexpected turn. On June 19th, President Zelensky delivered what amounted to a direct warning to Belarusian leader Alexander Lukashenko. Ukraine demanded that Belarus stop providing logistical support that was helping Russian drone and missile operations. The deadline was just 7 days. Many analysts expected the opposite reaction. They believed that the Kremlin would pressure Minsk to become even more involved in the war. Instead, something surprising happened. Only a few days later, on June 22nd, Belarus reportedly shut down repeater stations near the Ukrainian border that had been helping guide Russian drones and cruise missiles. It was a quiet decision, but its military significance was enormous. Those systems had supported attacks against northern Ukraine. Their removal immediately made parts of Ukraine's 1,085-kilometer northern frontier more difficult for Russia to exploit. For Kiev, this was more than a tactical victory. It demonstrated that Ukraine could influence the decision of Russia's closest ally without firing a single shot. But no one should mistake this move for a sudden change of heart. Lukashenko did not step back because he had become sympathetic to Ukraine. He stepped back because the financial risk of ignoring Kiev had become too great. Belarus has quietly become one of the biggest beneficiaries of Russia's fuel crisis. The country's two major refineries, Moscow and Novosibirsk, have become strategic economic assets, as Ukrainian long-range strikes repeatedly damage Russian refining capacity. Moscow increasingly relied on Belarusian facilities to process crude oil and supply finished fuel. The business arrangement is remarkably profitable. Russia ships crude oil to Belarus. Belarus refines it and then sells gasoline, and other fuel products back to Russia. Because Belarusian state companies are not subject to the same domestic price restriction imposed inside Russia, they can sell those products at significantly higher market prices. In many cases, Belarusian fuel has been worth 1.5 to 2 times more than comparable Russian supplies. The number tells the story. During the first 5 months of 2026, Belarusian gasoline export to Russia reportedly increased 13-fold compared with the previous year. What had once been a relatively small trade became one of the Minsk's most valuable revenue streams. Russian officials even set ambitious import targets, aiming to purchase hundreds of thousands of tons of Belarusian fuel every month. Then came Zelensky's warning. Ukraine made it clear that it was closely monitoring Belarus' role in sustaining Russia's war economy. Kiev never openly threatened to bomb the refineries, but it didn't have to. Everyone understood the implication. If Ukraine decided to extend its successful refinery campaign across the border, Moscow and Novosibirsk could become legitimate military targets. Losing those facilities would destroy one of Lukashenko's most profitable business overnight. The calculation became simple. Keeping Russian repeater system active offered limited military value for Belarus. Protecting billion-dollar refinery revenues offered overwhelming economic value. Faced with those choices, Lukashenko acted quickly. But while one threat appeared to shrink, another was quietly growing. Satellite imagery, intelligence reports, and Ukrainian officials began pointing to something much larger than electronic repeater stations. Across several sectors of Belarusian border, Construction crews were expanding roads, building fuel depots, preparing ammunition storage sites, and upgrading military infrastructure at pace not seen since the beginning of the invasion. On the surface, these projects look defensive, but according to Ukrainian intelligence, they were designed for something very different. Not to defend Belarus, to prepare the ground for Russia's next move. The new construction taking place along the Belarus-Ukraine border is not simply another military modernization program. According to Ukrainian intelligence, it is the completion of unfinished work left behind after Russia's failed invasion in Kiev 2022. French Foreign Intelligence Chief reportedly informed President Zelensky that military infrastructure is being expanded across multiple sectors stretching from the Brest region to Gomel. New ammunition depots, fuel storage facilities, logistic hubs, and roads capable of supporting heavy military convoys are nearing completion. Officials in Kiev argue that these projects have little value for ordinary border security. Their layout and design point toward one purpose: supporting large-scale military operations. To understand why this matters, it is very necessary to revisit the first weeks of the full-scale invasion. In February 2022, roughly 30,000 Russian troops entered Belarus under the cover of joint military exercise. From there, armored columns pushed south toward Kiev, hoping to seize the Ukrainian capital within days. Instead, the offensive collapsed. The problem was not a lack of firepower, it was logistics. Russian armored vehicles became trapped on narrow roads cutting through forests and marshland. Supply convoys stretched for dozens of kilometers, creating easy targets for Ukrainian drones, artillery, and special forces. Fuel trucks failed to reach advancing units, ammunition delivery slowed, and entire formations stalled before reaching their objective. The attack eventually unrevealed, forcing Russia to withdraw from northern Ukraine. For Moscow, that campaign exposed a painful lesson. Winning modern war depends as much on logistics as on combat power. Today, many of the weaknesses that doomed the 2022 offensive are being addressed. New roads improve mobility. Fuel depots reduce resupply distances. Ammunition storage sites allow forces to sustain operations much longer than before. Barracks and training facilities suggest that larger formations could be accommodated on Belarusian territory with far greater efficiency. Belarusian opposition groups, including former military personnel, are operating in exile, claim that more than 500 Belarusian industrial enterprises have become integrated into Russian defense production network. Reports also describe the construction of new firing ranges, expanded military camps, and additional support infrastructure close to the Ukrainian border. None of this prove that an invasion is imminent, but it significantly increases Russia's options. Several Western analysts believe this infrastructure will support three major operational scenarios. The first is the most obvious: another direct thrust toward Kiev. Although Russia failed along this route in 2022, the distance from the Belarusian border to the Ukrainian capital remains less than 100 kilometers. If supported by stronger logistics, Moscow could once again attempt to threaten Ukraine's political center. The second possibility is a Western offensive aimed at transportation corridors rather than the capital itself. Advancing towards cities such as Lusk and Rivne could disrupt the route used to move Western military aid into Ukraine, placing enormous pressure on Kiev's supply chain. The third scenario may be the most strategically important. Instead of launching a decisive breakthrough, Russia could simply force Ukraine to defend an entirely new front. The military planners estimate that such a move could extend active combat lines by around 160 kilometers. That alone would create a serious problem for Ukraine. Commander-in-Chief Sirisi has repeatedly warned that defending a wider front requires far more than relocating existing troops. He demands entirely new brigade, additional equipment, and thousands of fresh personnel. Every soldier sent north is one less soldier available to defend the brutal fighting in eastern and southern Ukraine. Even if Belarus never fires a single shot, simply allowing Russia to create that strategic dilemma would serve Moscow's objectives. At the same time, Belarus itself appears to be changing. Constitutional amendments have removed the country's previous commitment to neutrality and its nuclear weapon-free status. The government has expanded contract military recruitment, increased defense spending dramatically, and continued building a new southern operational command facing Ukraine. Mobilization reserves have grown substantially, while proposals for large territorial militia mirror policies already implemented in Russia. Supporters of the Belarusian opposition argue that these developments represent preparation for a future conflict rather than ordinary military reform. Whether that conflict will ever come remains uncertain. But one thing is becoming increasingly clear. The border separating Belarus and Ukraine is no longer a quiet frontier. It is steadily becoming one of the most heavily prepared military zones in Eastern Europe. If Belarus military preparations raise questions, Alexander Lukashenko's public statement make the picture even more confusing. In just a few days, he delivered messages that appear to contradict one another completely. On June 16th, Lukashenko gave an interview in which he attempted to soften his tone toward President Zelensky. He expressed regret over some of his previous remarks, an unusual gesture considering the hostile relationship between the two governments since the start of the invasion. But the apology came with an insult. While speaking about Zelensky, Lukashenko dismissed him as inexperienced and suggested he lacked the background to understand military affairs. Moments later, he admitted that Belarus itself remained highly vulnerable if the war expanded. He ended the interview with another warning, saying Ukraine would eventually reap what it sows. The Belarusian opposition, these mixed signals were no accident. Exiled opposition leaders argue that Lukashenko was trying to appear strong while quietly acknowledging that Ukraine had gained significant leverage. In their view, a leader who once demanded Ukraine's surrender was now being forced to change his language because the balance of power had shifted. Only days later, Ukraine's ultimatum regarding the border repeater system appeared to prove exactly that. Belarus complied. Yet on June 25th, Lukashenko once again changed his tone twice in the same day. Meeting Russia's ambassador, Boris Klizilov, he insisted that Belarus should not be dragged into the war. He claimed he had repeatedly told Vladimir Putin that ordinary Belarusians had no desire to fight Ukrainians. It sounded like the statement of a leader determined to preserve peace. But only a few minutes later, speaking before Russian officials, he declared that Belarus remained ready to provide Russia with every form of assistance necessary, including economic cooperation, industrial production, and security support. Those words carried enormous significance. Belarusian factories already manufacture components used in Russia's defense industry. Its transportation network continues to support Russia's logistics, while its refineries help ease Moscow's fuel shortages. In other words, even without sending combat troops, Belarus remains deeply connected to Russia's war effort. And even more revealing details soon emerge. Belarusian state media published Lukashenko's remarks about wanting to avoid war. Russian state media did not. According to observers, the statement disappeared entirely from Russian reports, fueling speculation that Moscow preferred not to highlight any sign of hesitation from its closest ally. Meanwhile, Lukashenko continued sending different messages to different audiences. To Russia, he promised loyalty. To Ukraine, he issued warnings. To his own people, he insisted Belarus wanted peace. Maintaining all three narratives at once is becoming increasingly difficult. And the reason may lie in pressure coming directly from Moscow. According to reports by the Wall Street Journal citing Russian and European officials, the Kremlin has spent months urging Belarus to allow its territory to play a larger role in military operations against Ukraine, while also supporting hybrid activities directed towards NATO members. The report claims that Moscow has not relied only on diplomacy. Instead, it has used economic dependency as leverage. Belarus relies heavily on Russia for energy supplies, financial assistance, preferential trade arrangements, and access to key markets. Every one of those relationships gives the Kremlin another tool to influence decisions in Minsk. Simply put, the more Belarus depends on Russia economically, the harder it becomes for Lukashenko to refuse Moscow's demands. This growing concern is no longer limited to Eastern Europe. Western leaders have also become increasingly involved. French President Emmanuel Macron reportedly contacted Lukashenko directly, urging him to keep Belarus out of the conflict. It was one of the highest level diplomatic contacts between the two countries since the full-scale invasion began. Ukraine, meanwhile, has chosen a different form of pressure. Rather than relying on diplomacy alone, Kiev has expanded its long-range campaign against Russia's military infrastructure and energy sector. The message is unmistakable. Any facility that materially supports Russia's war effort would eventually become part of Ukraine's target list. That warning hangs directly over Belarus refineries, transportation hubs, and military infrastructure. Today, Lukashenko finds himself squeezed from every direction. The Kremlin expects greater cooperation. Western governments urge restraint. Most Belarusians opposed entering the war. And Ukraine has demonstrated that it possesses both the capability and the willingness to strike strategic targets when necessary. For now, Belarus remains outside direct combat. But with every passing week, the space for neutrality continues to shrink. While Belarus continues balancing between Moscow and Kiev, Ukraine is preparing for the possibility that diplomacy could fail overnight. Since Russia's withdrawal from northern Ukraine in 2022, Kiev has quietly transformed its entire northern frontier into one of the most heavily fortified defensive zones in Europe. The 1,085-kilometer border with Belarus is no longer the vulnerable gateway at once it was. Across the marshland and forests of the Polisia region, Ukrainian engineers have spent 2 years digging trench systems, expanding minefields, installing anti-tank obstacles, and reinforcing the few roads capable of supporting armored vehicles. The same roads Russian forces used during their advance toward Kiev have been redesigned offensive kill zones intended to slow or completely stop another offensive. But Ukraine understands that modern warfare is no longer decided by trenches alone. Technology has become just as important as terrain. Commander-in-Chief Zelensky has ordered the deployment of specialized unmanned systems units along the Belarusian border. Their mission extends far beyond reconnaissance. These formations are trained to detect troop concentrations, strike logistical targets, protect critical infrastructure, and respond within minutes to any sudden movement across the frontier. Ukraine has invested heavily in drone warfare since the beginning of the invasion, turning battlefield innovation into one of its greatest strategic advantages. Millions of unmanned systems have already been produced, and production continues to accelerate. While Russia manufactures drones on a larger scale, many analysts believe Ukraine continues to maintain an edge in flexibility, battlefield adaptation, and operational creativity. This capability has also changed the nature of deterrence. According to Ukrainian military officials, hundreds of potential military targets inside Belarus have already been identified should Minsk allow its territory to become an active launching pad for Russia's operations again. The message is unmistakable. Any future offensive would carry immediate consequences not only for Russian forces, but also for the infrastructure supporting them. Even so, military experts caution against assuming Ukraine holds every advantage. Retired U.S. Army General Ben Hodges has argued that although Ukraine's long-range strike capabilities has improved dramatically, important challenges remain. Russian electronic warfare continues disrupting GPS-guided systems, while deep logistical targets can still be difficult to reach consistently. The battlefield, therefore, remains a contest of adaptation rather than absolute superiority. This brings us to the central question. Will Belarus actually enter the war? The evidence points in two different directions. On one hand, several factors argued against direct participation. Belarus maintains a relatively small active military compared to Russia. Independent analysts question whether it possesses the manpower needed for sustained offensive operations without a massive nationwide mobilization, one that would place enormous strain on the country's economy. Public opinion presents another obstacle. Independent polling has consistently suggested that most Belarusians oppose direct involvement in the war. After the mass protests of 2020, Lukashenko understands that another deeply unpopular decision could generate serious internal instability. Some international analysts also note that there is still no confirmed evidence of a large Russian combat building up inside Belarus comparable to early 2022. They argue that Kiev's public warnings may also serve a strategic purpose by encouraging continued Western military support. Yet, history offers an important reminder. Before the invasion in February 2022, many observers also believed Belarus would stay out of the conflict. Technically, Belarusian combat units did not spearhead the assault, but Russian troops crossed Belarusian territory, launched missiles from Belarusian soil, used Belarusian airspace, and relied on Belarusian logistics throughout the opening phase of the invasion. That precedent changes everything. The real issue is no longer whether Belarus formally declares war. The more important question is whether Russia can once again use Belarus as a platform for military operations, and whether Alexander Lukashenko still has the political freedom to refuse. At the moment, the answer remains uncertain. His economic survival depends heavily on Moscow. His domestic stability depends on avoiding another unpopular war. His country's most profitable industries remain vulnerable to Ukrainian strike. And Vladimir Putin continues demanding greater cooperation from his closest ally. For now, Belarus stands between two opposing forces, trying to avoid becoming the next battlefield. But history has shown that in this war, circumstances can change far faster than political decisions. Whether the northern border remains quiet or once again becomes the gateway to a major offensive may ultimately depend less on what Lukashenko wants than on what the Kremlin decides it needs. One thing is certain: the border between Belarus and Ukraine is no longer just a line on the map. It has become one of the most important strategic fault lines in the entire war. If events there begin to move, the consequences will be felt far beyond Eastern Europe. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this deep analysis, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and turn on the notification key. Thank you for watching.